There is something particular about the way people remember Massachusetts in the 1970s. It was not a decade of dramatic headlines or sweeping transformations that announced themselves loudly. Instead, it was a time of quiet shifts, of familiar routines continuing even as the ground beneath them slowly changed. For those who lived through it, the 1970s in Massachusetts felt like standing between two eras, one foot still planted in the old world and the other stepping cautiously into something not yet fully formed. The decade began with the echoes of the 1960s still lingering in the air. The protests, the social movements, the sense of upheaval that had defined the previous years were fading into memory. What replaced them was something harder to name. It was not peace exactly, nor was it resolution. It was more like a collective exhale, a moment when people turned their attention back to the ordinary business of living. The big questions remained, but they receded into the background as daily life reasserted itself. Massachusetts in those years carried a weight of history that shaped everything. The old brick buildings, the narrow streets of Boston, the mill towns scattered across the landscape, all of it spoke to generations of people who had come before. Walking through the state in the 1970s meant walking through layers of time. The Puritan past, the Revolutionary era, the great waves of immigration, the industrial boom, all of these had left their marks on the land and on the people who called it home. Yet for all that history, there was also a sense that something was ending. The certainties that had defined earlier generations were becoming harder to hold on to. The factories that had employed grandfathers and fathers were growing quieter. The neighborhoods that had once been tightly knit communities were beginning to change. The future, whatever it might hold, was no longer as predictable as it had once seemed. People who remember those years often describe them with a mixture of fondness and melancholy. There is nostalgia for the slower pace, for the way life seemed more contained and manageable. There is also an awareness that the world was shifting in ways that would only become clear later. The 1970s in Massachusetts were not about crisis. They were about transition, and transitions, by their nature, are felt more than they are seen. The weather seemed to matter more then. The long winters, the brief and brilliant autumns, the humid summers that drove people to the beaches, all of these marked the rhythm of the year in ways that felt inescapable. Life was organized around the seasons, around the school calendar, around the rituals of holidays and family gatherings. There was a predictability to it that could feel both comforting and confining. For many, the 1970s were the years of childhood or young adulthood, and memory has a way of softening those times. The difficulties fade while the small pleasures remain vivid. The taste of a particular food, the sound of a song on the radio, the feeling of walking down a familiar street on a summer evening, these are the things that stay with people. They become the texture of memory, the details that bring a vanished world back to life. Massachusetts in the 1970s was a place where the past and the future existed side by side, often uneasily. It was a state still defined by its history, but beginning to imagine new possibilities. The old industries were fading, but new ones were starting to emerge. The cities were changing, but the neighborhoods still held on to their identities. It was a time of waiting, of uncertainty, of quiet transformation. And for those who lived through it, it remains a decade that shaped who they would become, The textile mills had been the heartbeat of Massachusetts for generations. From the great brick complexes of Lowell to the smaller factories scattered through towns across the state, the rhythm of the looms had defined life for countless families. Immigrants from Ireland, from French Canada, from Portugal, from Poland, and from a dozen other places had come to work in those mills. They had built communities around them, raised children, established churches and social clubs, and created a way of life that seemed as permanent as the buildings themselves. By the 1970s, that world was fading. The mills had been slowing for decades, losing ground to cheaper labor in the American South and eventually overseas. But it was in the 70s that the decline became impossible to ignore. One by one, the great factories fell silent. The machinery that had run day and night for a century grew still. The workers who had spent their lives tending the looms found themselves without jobs, without the skills that the new economy demanded, without a clear sense of what came next. The shoe factories told a similar story. Massachusetts had once been the shoemaking capital of America. Cities like Lynn and Brockton and Haverhill had built their identities around the craft. The smell of leather, the sound of cutting machines, the sight of workers streaming through factory gates at shift change, these had been the defining features of daily life. But the same forces that were closing the textile mills were closing the shoe factories too. The work was moving away, and nothing was moving in to replace it. What remained were the buildings themselves, the great mill complexes with their rows of windows and their towering smokestacks became monuments to a vanished era. Some stood empty, their windows broken, their interiors slowly decaying. Others found new uses, converted into apartments or offices or shopping centers. But even when they were repurposed, they carried the memory of what they had been. Walking past them, people could still imagine the thousands of workers who had once filled their floors, the noise and heat and constant motion that had defined life inside. The towns that had grown up around these industries faced difficult adjustments. When the main employer in a community closes, everything else is affected. The shops that had served the workers lost their customers. The tax base that had funded schools and services shrank. Young people, seeing no future in their hometowns, began to leave for Boston or for other parts of the country. The population aged, and the streets grew quieter. Yet there was also resilience. People found ways to adapt, to make do, to build new lives from the pieces of the old. Some retrained for different kinds of work. Others started small businesses or found jobs in the service sector. The communities did not disappear. They changed, sometimes painfully, but they endured. The identity that had been built around the mills and factories evolved into something new, something that honored the past while accepting that it could not be reclaimed. There was a matter-of-factness to how people talked about these changes. This was not a story of villains and victims, of blame and recrimination. It was simply what was happening, the way the world was moving. The mills had come, and now they were going. The work that had sustained generations was no longer there. People did what they had always done. They carried on. They made the best of things. They remembered what had been while looking for what might come next. The empty mills became part of the landscape, as familiar as the rivers that had once powered them. Children grew up playing in their shadows, not fully understanding what they had been. The stories of the old days were passed down, growing hazier with each generation. But the buildings remained, brick and mortar testimony to a way of life that had shaped Massachusetts for more than a century. In the 1970s, that way of life was ending, and everyone knew it, even if no one could say exactly what would take its place. Boston in the 1970s was a city in the middle of remaking itself. The old Boston, the city of narrow streets and aging buildings and neighborhoods that had remained largely unchanged for decades, was being transformed. New construction was rising across the downtown. Government buildings, office towers, and civic projects were reshaping the skyline. The city that emerged by the end of the decade looked different from the one that had entered it. The most visible symbol of this transformation was Government Center, where the old Scollay Square had once stood. With its theaters and bars and slightly disreputable charm, there was now a vast plaza of brick and concrete. City Hall, a massive structure of raw concrete in the brutalist style, dominated the space. It was a building that divided opinion sharply. Some saw it as bold and modern, a statement of civic ambition. Others found it cold and forbidding, a monument to the wrong kind of progress. But whatever people thought of it, they could not ignore it. It announced that Boston was changing, that the old ways were giving way to something new. The highways that cut through the city were another mark of transformation. The Central Artery, an elevated expressway that ran through downtown, had been completed in the previous decade, but its effects were still being felt in the 70s. It had divided neighborhoods, cut off the waterfront from the rest of the city, and created a constant presence of noise and traffic in the heart of Boston. People adapted to it, as they adapted to everything, but it remained a source of frustration and complaint. The promise of easy movement through the city had come at a cost that was becoming clearer with each passing year. The neighborhoods of Boston each had their own character, their own rhythms, their own ways of life. South Boston, with its Irish heritage and tight-knit community. The North End, where Italian families had lived for generations, and the smell of fresh bread and espresso filled the narrow streets. Roxbury and Dorchester, with their diverse populations and their own distinct identities. Beacon Hill, with its brick sidewalks and gas lamps and air of old money. Back Bay, with its elegant brownstones and its proximity to the shops of Newbury Street. Each neighborhood was a world unto itself, and people often spent their entire lives within a few square miles. Getting around the city meant navigating a system that was both familiar and frustrating. The subway, known simply as the T, was one of the oldest in the country, and it showed its age. The trains were often crowded, sometimes late, occasionally broken down entirely, but they connected the neighborhoods to downtown and to each other, and for many people they were the essential thread that held daily life together. The Green Line rattled through its tunnels. The Red Line carried commuters from Cambridge and Point South. The Orange Line and the Blue Line completed the network, each with its own personality and its own loyal riders. The streets of downtown were busy with shoppers and office workers. Feline's Basement, the legendary discount store, drew crowds who came to hunt for bargains among the racks of markdown merchandise. The automatic markdown system, where prices dropped the longer items remained unsold, created a kind of sport out of shopping. People would track items they wanted, waiting for the price to fall while hoping no one else would snatch them first. It was a ritual that belonged uniquely to Boston, a shared experience that crossed lines of class and neighborhood. The waterfront, long neglected and cut off by the highway, was beginning to stir with new possibilities. Quincy Market, the historic marketplace near Faneuil Hall, was being transformed into a festival marketplace, a new concept that would bring shops and restaurants and crowds of visitors to a space that had fallen into disuse. The project, which opened in the middle of the decade, became a model for urban revitalization across the country. It showed that old buildings could find new life, that the past could be a foundation for the future rather than an obstacle to it. Boston in the 1970s was not an easy city. It was crowded, expensive, often frustrating. The winters were harsh, the traffic was terrible, and the old infrastructure strained under the demands placed upon it. But it was also a city of tremendous vitality, of deep roots, of communities that had weathered generations of change and emerged with their identities intact. For those who lived there, it was simply home, with all the complications and affections that word implies. The neighborhoods of Boston were more than just places where people lived. They were communities in the fullest sense, places where identity was formed and maintained, where generations of families had put down roots, and where the rhythms of daily life created bonds that were difficult to break. In the 1970s, these neighborhoods retained much of the character they had developed over the previous century, even as the forces of change pressed against them. The triple-decker was the defining architecture of Boston's neighborhoods. These three-story wooden houses, with a separate apartment on each floor, had been built by the thousands in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to house the workers who filled the city's factories. By the 70s, they were showing their age. The paint was often peeling, the porches sagging, the interiors in need of updating. But they remained the backbone of neighborhood life, providing affordable housing for families who might otherwise have been priced out of the city. Living in a triple-decker meant living in close proximity to neighbors. The sounds of daily life traveled through the floors and walls. Children playing, televisions murmuring, arguments and celebrations, all of it was shared whether people wanted to share it or not. This closeness could be a source of friction, but it was also a source of connection. Neighbors knew each other's business, looked out for each other's children, borrowed cups of sugar, and helped shovel snow. The boundaries between private and public life were more porous than they would later become. The local shops were the anchors of neighborhood commerce. Before the spread of supermarkets and chain stores, people did much of their shopping within walking distance of home. The corner store, the butcher, the baker, the hardware store, each served a specific need, and each was run by someone who knew the customers by name. Shopping was not just a transaction, but a social occasion, a chance to catch up on news and gossip, to maintain the connections that held the community together. The parish church was often the center of neighborhood life, especially in the Catholic communities that dominated much of Boston. Sunday Mass was not just a religious obligation, but a social gathering, a time when the whole community came together. The church ran schools, organized social events, provided assistance to families in need. The priest was a figure of authority and respect, someone whose opinion mattered on questions that went far beyond theology. For many families, the church was the institution that gave structure and meaning to life. Children in these neighborhoods grew up with a freedom that would later seem remarkable. They played in the streets and the vacant lots, roaming in packs with minimal adult supervision. The boundaries of their world were set by the neighborhood itself. Everyone knew whose children belonged to whom, and any adult felt entitled to correct any child who stepped out of line. This informal network of supervision meant that children could explore and play with a degree of independence that their own children and grandchildren would rarely experience. The rhythms of neighborhood life followed the calendar. Summer meant stickball games and fire hydrants opened to provide relief from the heat. Fall meant the return to school and the changing of the leaves. Winter meant snow days and sledding and the challenge of keeping warm in drafty old buildings. Spring meant Easter and the first warm days when people emerged from their homes to reclaim the streets and porches. Each season had its rituals, its pleasures, its particular character. There was also insularity to neighborhood life. People often stayed close to home, venturing into other parts of the city only when necessary. The neighborhood provided everything that was needed for daily life, and there was a comfort in that self-sufficiency. But it also meant that the city was experienced as a collection of separate villages, rather than as a unified whole. People might live their entire lives in Boston without ever really knowing neighborhoods just a few miles from their own. By the end of the 70s, these patterns were beginning to change. Young professionals were discovering the charm of the old neighborhoods and the convenience of city living. Rents were starting to rise. The old families were beginning to disperse to the suburbs. The character that had defined these communities for generations was starting to shift. But in the 1970s, the old ways still held. The neighborhoods were still recognizable as what they had always been, places where people knew each other, where life was lived on a human scale, where the past was present in every brick and cobblestone. Housing in Massachusetts during the 1970s occupied a different place in people's lives than it would in later decades. It was, for most people, simply shelter, a practical necessity, rather than an investment strategy or a statement of identity. The houses and apartments where people lived were often old, sometimes cramped, frequently in need of repair. But they were affordable in ways that would later seem almost unimaginable, and they provided the stability that allowed families to put down roots and build lives. Renting was common, especially in the cities. The triple-deckers and apartment buildings that filled Boston's neighborhoods housed families who might stay for years or even decades without ever owning the place where they lived. Landlords were often local, sometimes living in the same building as their tenants. The relationship between landlord and tenant was personal in a way that would become rarer as real estate became increasingly corporatized. Rents were paid in cash or by check, often handed directly to the landlord on the first of the month. The apartments themselves were modest by later standards. Kitchens were small, often with appliances that dated back decades. Bathrooms were functional rather than luxurious. Heating came from radiators that clanked and hissed, powered by boilers in the basement that required constant attention during the winter months. Air conditioning was rare, a luxury that most families did without. Summer meant open windows and electric fans, and on the hottest nights, people slept on porches or fire escapes to catch whatever breeze might come. For those who owned their homes, the house was typically the largest purchase they would ever make. but it was not yet the all-consuming financial commitment it would become. Mortgages were simpler, usually fixed-rate loans from local banks or savings and loans. The idea of a house as a vehicle for wealth accumulation was present but not dominant. People bought houses to live in them, to raise families, to have a place that was their own. The constant calculation of equity and appreciation that would later define home ownership was still in the future. The cost of living in Massachusetts was higher than in many parts of the country, but it was still manageable for working families. A factory job or a position in a trade could support a household, pay the rent or the mortgage, put food on the table, and leave something over for modest pleasures. The squeeze that would later make Massachusetts one of the most expensive places in America to live was not yet fully felt. There was still room for people of ordinary means to make a life in the cities and towns where they had grown up. Home improvement was often a do-it-yourself affair. Fathers and grandfathers spent weekends painting, fixing, building. The skills of basic maintenance were passed down through generations, and there was pride in being able to handle problems without calling in professionals. Hardware stores were staffed by people who could advise on any project, and neighbors helped each other with tasks that required extra hands. The house was not just a place to live, but a project, something that required ongoing attention and care. The stability of housing meant stability in other areas of life. Children grew up in the same neighborhoods, attended the same schools, formed friendships that lasted for years. Families knew their neighbors, watched out for each other, built the networks of mutual support that made community life possible. The house or apartment was the anchor around which everything else was organized. It was not perfect, often not even comfortable by later standards, but it was home. Cambridge in the 1970s existed in a kind of parallel universe to the rest of Massachusetts. Just across the Charles River from Boston, it was close enough to be part of the metropolitan area, but distinct enough to have its own character, its own rhythms, its own way of life. The presence of Harvard and MIT shaped everything about the city, creating an atmosphere that was more intellectual, more bohemian, more open to unconventional ideas than almost anywhere else in the state. Harvard Square was the heart of this world. The intersection where Massachusetts Avenue met Brattle Street and John F. Kennedy Street was a gathering place for students, professors, artists, musicians, and anyone else who wanted to be part of the scene. The square was lined with bookstores, more bookstores per block than perhaps anywhere else in the country. The Harvard Coop, the university's cooperative store, anchored one corner. Smaller shops offered used books, rare books, academic books, books on every subject imaginable. For those who loved to read, Harvard Square was a kind of paradise. The coffee shops and cafes of the square were gathering places where ideas were exchanged and arguments conducted. People sat for hours over cups of coffee, reading, writing, talking. The atmosphere was informal but intense. Conversations ranged from philosophy to politics to the latest developments in science or art. There was a sense that ideas mattered, that the life of the mind was a worthy pursuit, that being smart and curious was something to be celebrated rather than hidden. The students who filled Cambridge came from all over the world. Harvard and MIT drew the brightest young people from every state and dozens of countries, creating a community that was remarkably diverse in its origins, even if it was somewhat narrow in its focus. These students brought energy and idealism to the city. They filled the apartments and rooming houses, crowded the libraries and laboratories, and spilled out into the streets and squares. Their presence gave Cambridge a youthful vitality that set it apart from the more settled neighborhoods of Boston. The faculty and researchers who taught at the universities were another presence in the city. These were people at the top of their fields, engaged in work that was pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. They lived in the gracious houses of Brattle Street and the more modest homes of the neighborhoods beyond. They could be seen walking to campus, briefcases in hand, or sitting in the cafes, lost in thought. Their presence gave Cambridge a sense of seriousness, a feeling that important work was being done. Beyond the universities, Cambridge had its own neighborhoods with their own characters. East Cambridge, closer to Boston, was more working class, home to families who had lived there for generations. Inman Square and Central Square had their own commercial districts, their own gathering places, their own communities. The city was not just a college town, but a real place where real people lived ordinary lives alongside the extraordinary institution in their midst. The counterculture of the 1960s had left its mark on Cambridge. Head shops and record stores, vegetarian restaurants and craft cooperatives, all of these could be found in and around Harvard Square. Young people with long hair and unconventional clothes were a common sight. The spirit of questioning and experimentation that had defined the previous decade lingered on, even as it was beginning to fade elsewhere. Cambridge remained a place where alternative ways of living were accepted, even celebrated. Music was part of the atmosphere. Street musicians played in Harvard Square, their guitar cases open for donations. The clubs and coffee houses hosted folk singers and jazz musicians, rock bands and classical ensembles. Club Passim, in a basement just off the square, was a legendary venue for acoustic music, a place where careers were launched and where the traditions of folk music were kept alive. The sound of music drifted through the streets, adding to the sense that Cambridge was a place apart, a city where creativity and expression were woven into daily life. For those who lived in Cambridge in the 1970s, it was a place of tremendous intellectual and cultural richness. It was also a place of high rents and crowded streets, of competition and pressure, of the constant awareness that one was surrounded by people of exceptional ability. It was not always easy, but it was never dull. Cambridge offered a way of life that was available nowhere else in Massachusetts, and for those who were drawn to it, there was no substitute. While the old industries of Massachusetts were fading, something new was quietly taking shape along Route 128, the highway that curved around Boston in a great arc from the North Shore to the South Shore. In the 1970s, this stretch of road was becoming home to a new kind of economy, one based not on manufacturing physical goods, but on creating and manipulating information. The technology companies that clustered along Route 128 were laying the groundwork for changes that would transform not just Massachusetts, but the entire world. The names of these companies were not yet household words, but within certain circles they were spoken with respect and excitement. Digital Equipment Corporation, known as DEC, was one of the giants. Based in Maynard, in an old mill building that had once housed a woolen company, DEC made mini-computers, machines that were smaller and more affordable than the massive mainframes that had dominated computing. These mini computers were finding their way into businesses and laboratories, making computing power available to organizations that could never have afforded the giant machines of the previous generation. Wong Laboratories was another major presence. Founded by An Wong, an immigrant from China who had studied at Harvard, the company had grown from a small operation into a significant force in the emerging world of office automation. Wong's word processors were transforming how documents were created and edited, replacing typewriters with screens and keyboards, making it possible to revise and correct without retyping entire pages. The company's headquarters in Lowell, in another repurposed mill building, symbolized the transition from the old economy to the new. Dozens of smaller companies filled the office parks that lined Route 128. These were firms working on electronics, on software, on instruments and devices of all kinds. Many had been founded by engineers and scientists who had trained at MIT or Harvard, who had seen possibilities in the research they had done and had set out to turn those possibilities into products. The atmosphere was entrepreneurial, optimistic, forward-looking. There was a sense that technology could solve problems, create opportunities, make life better. The workers in these companies were different from the factory workers of the previous generation. They were engineers and programmers, technicians and researchers. They wore ties and short-sleeved shirts rather than work clothes. They sat at desks rather than standing at machines. Their work was mental rather than physical, and it required education and training that the old jobs had not demanded. The shift from manufacturing to technology was also a shift in what it meant to work, in what skills were valued, in how careers were built. The office parks themselves were a new kind of landscape. Low-slung buildings set back from the road, surrounded by parking lots, accessible only by car. There were no sidewalks, no corner stores, no sense of neighborhood. These were places designed for work and nothing else. Employees drove in, parked, went inside, and emerged hours later to drive home. The social world of the factory, where workers knew each other and formed bonds over years of shared labor, was replaced by something more fragmented, more individualized. Yet there was also excitement in these places. The people who worked in the technology companies of Route 128 knew they were part of something new. They were building machines that could do things that had never been done before. They were solving problems that had never been solved. They were creating the future, or at least a version of it. The long hours and the pressure were balanced by the thrill of innovation, by the sense that the work mattered. By the end of the 1970s, Route 128 had established itself as one of the leading technology centers in the country. The term Massachusetts Miracle had not yet been coined, but the foundations for it were being laid. The old industries might be fading, but something new was rising to take their place. The transition was not complete, and it would bring its own challenges and disruptions. But for those who could see what was happening, there was reason for hope. Massachusetts was not just holding on to the past, it was building something new. Massachusetts extended far beyond Boston and its immediate suburbs. The state encompassed mill towns and fishing villages, college towns and farming communities, resort areas, and quiet rural landscapes. Life in these places followed its own rhythms, shaped by local economies and local traditions that were often quite different from what prevailed in the capital. The mill towns of the Merrimack Valley and the Blackstone Valley had been built around the textile industry, and they bore the marks of that history in every street and building. Lowell, Lawrence, Fall River, New Bedford, these cities had once been powerhouses of American manufacturing. By the 1970s, they were struggling to find new identities. The mills were closing or had already closed. The workers who had filled them were aging, and their children were leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Yet the communities endured, held together by the bonds of family and neighborhood, by the churches and social clubs that had served generations. Worcester, in the center of the state, was a city of its own, distinct from Boston and proud of its independence. It had its own industries, its own institutions, its own way of life. The city was home to colleges and hospitals, to factories and shops, to neighborhoods that had their own characters and histories. Worcester people did not think of themselves as living in Boston's shadow. They had their own city, their own concerns, their own identity. Springfield, in the western part of the state, was the urban center of a region that often felt overlooked by those in the east. The Connecticut River Valley had its own economy, its own culture, its own sense of itself. Springfield had been a manufacturing center, home to the famous armory that had produced weapons for American wars since the Revolution. By the 70s, the city was facing the same challenges as other industrial centers, but it retained a vitality and a pride that sustained it through difficult times. Cape Cod was a world apart. The long arm of land that curved out into the Atlantic had been a fishing and farming community for centuries before it became a summer resort. By the 1970s, tourism had become the dominant industry, and the Cape's population swelled every summer with visitors from Boston and New York and beyond. The beaches, the quaint villages, the seafood restaurants, all of these drew people seeking escape from the pressures of urban life. For those who lived there year-round, the Cape had a different character, quieter and more isolated once the summer crowds departed. The islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket had their own distinct identities. Once centers of the whaling industry, they had become retreats for the wealthy and the artistic. The ferries that connected them to the mainland were lifelines, bringing supplies and visitors and connecting the islands to the larger world. Life on the islands moved at its own pace, shaped by the sea and the seasons, by traditions that stretched back generations. The fishing towns of the North Shore and the South Shore continued to send boats out after cod and haddock, lobster and scallops. Gloucester, the oldest fishing port in America, remained a working waterfront, its harbor filled with trawlers and its streets lined with the businesses that supported the fleet. The fishing life was hard and dangerous, but it was also a source of identity and pride. Families had been fishing these waters for generations, and they intended to continue. Western Massachusetts, beyond the Connecticut River Valley, was a landscape of small towns and rolling hills, of farms and forests, of communities where everyone knew everyone else. The pace of life was slower there, the connections to Boston more tenuous. People in the Berkshires and the hill towns lived according to rhythms set by the land and the seasons, by the needs of agriculture and the patterns of rural life. It was a different Massachusetts from the one most people thought of, but it was no less real. Food in Massachusetts during the 1970s was a matter of tradition and comfort, rather than innovation or experimentation. People ate what their parents and grandparents had eaten, what their ethnic communities had brought with them from the old country, what the land and sea provided. The meals that appeared on the tables across the state were simple, hearty, and deeply rooted in place and history. New England staples formed the foundation. Baked beans, slow-cooked with molasses and salt pork, were a Saturday night tradition in many households. Brown bread, dense and slightly sweet, often accompanied them. Clam chowder, the creamy New England version, was a point of regional pride, and arguments about the proper way to make it could become surprisingly heated. The very idea of adding tomatoes, as they did in Manhattan, was considered somewhere between a mistake and an offense. The sea provided abundantly. Lobster, once so common it had been considered poor people's food, had become a delicacy, but it was still more affordable and accessible than it would later become. Families gathered for lobster bakes on summer evenings, the red shells piling up as the sun went down. Fried clams, served in paper boats at roadside stands, were a summer ritual. Fish and chips, the batter crispy and the fish fresh from local waters, could be found in shops throughout the coastal towns. The Italian community had left its mark on the food of Massachusetts, especially in Boston's North End. The bakeries there produced breads and pastries that drew people from across the city. Cannoli, the crispy shells filled with sweet ricotta cream, were a special treat. Pizza, not yet the ubiquitous food it would become, was still associated with Italian neighborhoods and Italian restaurants. The groceries and delis of the North End sold imported cheeses and cured meats, olive oils and dried pastas, ingredients that were harder to find elsewhere. The Portuguese community, concentrated in cities like Fall River and New Bedford, had its own culinary traditions. Linguiça, the spicy sausage, appeared at breakfast tables and in countless recipes. Portuguese sweetbread, slightly sweet and wonderfully soft, was a staple. The fishing heritage of the community meant that seafood was central to the cuisine, prepared in ways that had been brought from the Azores and adapted to the New World. Dunkin Donuts was becoming a fixture of daily life. The chain, founded in Quincy in the 1950s, had spread across Massachusetts and was beginning its expansion across the country. But in the 70s, it was still primarily a local phenomenon, a place where people stopped for coffee and donuts on their way to work, where cops really did sit at the counter, where the simple pleasure of a fresh donut and a hot cup of coffee was available on almost every corner. The coffee was not fancy, but it was reliable, and the ritual of the morning stop became woven into the fabric of daily routine. Meals were eaten at home more often than they would be in later decades. Families gathered around the table for dinner, and the food that appeared there was usually cooked from scratch. Convenience foods existed, but they had not yet taken over. Mothers and grandmothers spent time in the kitchen preparing the dishes they had learned from their own mothers and grandmothers. The recipes were rarely written down. They were carried in memory, passed along through demonstration and practice, part of an inheritance that was as valuable as any material possession. Sports in Massachusetts during the 1970s were not just entertainment. They were a shared language, a common experience, a way of marking time and building community. The teams that represented the state, especially the professional teams of Boston, commanded a loyalty that bordered on devotion. Following them through their seasons of triumph and heartbreak was part of what it meant to live in Massachusetts. The Red Sox were the center of this sporting universe, Fenway Park, the ancient ballpark in the heart of the city, was a cathedral for the faithful. Its quirks and limitations, the green monster looming over left field, the cramped seats and obstructed views, were not flaws but features, part of what made it sacred ground. People who had never been inside its walls still felt connected to it, still organized their summers around the rhythm of the baseball season. The 1970s were years of both hope and heartbreak for Red Sox fans. The team had talented players, names that would become legendary. Carl Yastrzemski, who had been the hero of the impossible dream season of 1967, was still playing, still producing, still carrying the hopes of the region on his shoulders. Jim Rice emerged as a powerful presence in the lineup. Fred Lynn brought grace and skill to center field. Luis Tiant, with his distinctive windup, became a fan favorite on the mound. The 1975 season brought the team to the World Series, and the sixth game of that series became one of the most famous baseball games ever played. Carlton Fisk's home run in the 12th inning, his body language willing the ball to stay fair as it sailed toward the left field foul pole, was a moment that transcended sports. People who watched it never forgot where they were, what they felt, how they reacted. That the Red Sox lost the series in the seventh game only deepened the emotional complexity of the experience. Joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment, these were the currencies of Red Sox fandom. The Celtics offered a different kind of experience. The basketball team had dominated the sport in the 1960s, winning championship after championship under the leadership of Red Auerbach and the brilliance of Bill Russell. By the 70s, that dynasty had ended, and the team was in a period of transition. The championships would return in the 80s, but during the 70s, Celtics fans had to content themselves with memories of past glory and hopes for future revival. Still, the Boston Garden, with its parquet floor and its cramped quarters, remained a special place, and the green and white of the Celtics remained a source of pride. The Bruins brought hockey to the forefront of Boston sports consciousness. Bobby Orr, perhaps the greatest defenseman ever to play the game, was at the peak of his powers in the early 70s. His ability to control the game, to rush up the ice and create scoring chances, to play defense with equal brilliance, made him a transcendent figure. The image of Orr flying through the air after scoring the goal that won the Stanley Cup in 1970 became one of the most iconic photographs in sports history. The Bruins won another championship in '72, and even as injuries began to take their toll on Orr, the team remained a force. The Patriots, the football team, were the least successful of the major professional franchises during this period. They played in a stadium that was far from Boston in Foxborough, and they struggled to compete with the better teams in the league. But they had their loyal fans, people who bundled up against the cold and made the trek to watch games that often ended in disappointment. The loyalty of these fans would eventually be rewarded, but that was far in the future. In the 70s, being a Patriots fan required patience and faith. Sports provided a common ground where differences could be set aside. In a city and a state that could be divided along lines of neighborhood and ethnicity, of class and background, the teams belonged to everyone. Arguments about players and strategies, memories of great games and bitter losses, these were shared across all the boundaries that otherwise separated people. The sports pages of the newspapers were read as carefully as any other section, and the conversations they sparked were part of the daily rhythm of life. The weather in Massachusetts was not just a backdrop to life, but an active participant in it. The state's location in New England meant that it experienced all four seasons in their fullest expression, and the rhythm of the year was shaped by the changing conditions that each season brought. People planned their lives around the weather, adapted to its demands, and found in its patterns a structure that gave shape to the passing of time. Summer in Massachusetts was a season of escape. The heat and humidity that settled over the cities drove people toward the water, toward the beaches of the Cape and the North Shore and the South Shore. Those who could afford it fled to summer cottages or rented houses by the sea. Those who could not made do with day trips, packing into cars early in the morning to claim a spot on the sand before the crowds arrived. The beaches were democratic spaces where families of all backgrounds spread their blankets and coolers, where children built sand castles and adults dozed in the sun. The cities in summer could be oppressive. The old buildings trapped the heat, and without air conditioning, there was little relief. People sat on stoops and porches in the evenings, hoping for a breeze. Fire hydrants were opened illegally, sending streams of water into the streets where children played. The nights were often too hot for sleep, and tempers could fray as the heat stretched on day after day. Summer was a season to be endured as much as enjoyed, at least for those who could not escape to cooler places. Autumn was the glory of New England. The transformation of the leaves from green to gold and orange and red drew visitors from around the world. The hills of western Massachusetts and the forests of the north blazed with color, and people drove for hours just to witness the spectacle. The air turned crisp, the skies cleared, and there was a sense of energy and renewal after the languor of summer. Football season began, and the rhythms of school resumed. Autumn was a season of beginnings, even as the natural world was preparing for its long sleep. The first frost was a marker, a signal that the easy days were ending. Gardens were put to bed, summer furniture was stored away, and the preparations for winter began. There was a quickening of activity, a sense that things needed to be done before the cold set in. The harvest festivals and Halloween and Thanksgiving followed in quick succession, each one marking another step toward the dark months ahead. Winter in Massachusetts was a serious matter. The cold could be brutal, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and staying there for weeks at a time. The snow, when it came, could paralyze the cities and towns, burying cars and blocking roads, closing schools and businesses. The great storms were remembered for years afterward, measured against each other, their depths and durations becoming part of local legend. Shoveling out after a blizzard was a communal activity, neighbors helping neighbors, the shared labor creating bonds that lasted beyond the emergency. The short days of winter meant long hours of darkness. People went to work in the dark and came home in the dark, seeing the sun only through office windows if they saw it at all. The cold kept people indoors, and cabin fever was a real phenomenon. The holidays provided relief, Christmas and New Year's bringing light and celebration to the darkest time of the year. But January and February stretched on, gray and cold, testing the endurance of even the most committed New Englanders. Spring, when it finally came, was greeted with something approaching rapture. The first warm days when people could go outside without coats, when the snow finally melted and the ground began to soften. These were moments of genuine joy. The crocuses and daffodils that pushed up through the still cold earth were signs of hope, promises that the long winter was truly ending. Spring in Massachusetts was often brief and muddy, but it was also a season of renewal, a reminder that the cycle would continue, that warmth and light would return. Massachusetts had always been a center of education, and in the 1970s, this identity was as strong as ever. The colleges and universities that dotted the state were not just institutions of learning, but engines of the economy, shapers of culture, anchors of community life. They drew students and faculty from around the world, created jobs and opportunities, and gave Massachusetts a character that set it apart from other places. Harvard was the oldest and most famous, its name synonymous with excellence and prestige. The university's influence extended far beyond its Cambridge campus. Its graduates filled positions of power in government and business, in law and medicine, in every field where education and credentials mattered. The Harvard name opened doors, created connections, conferred advantages that lasted a lifetime. For those who attended, it was a transformative experience. For those who lived in its shadow, it was a constant presence, sometimes inspiring, sometimes intimidating, always impossible to ignore. MIT, just down the river from Harvard, had a different character, but equal prestige. The institute was focused on science and engineering, on the practical application of knowledge to solve real problems. Its graduates were building the technology companies of Route 128, designing the systems and devices that were changing how people lived and worked. The culture of MIT was intense and demanding, but it also fostered a spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship that would have enormous consequences for Massachusetts and the world. Beyond these giants, dozens of other institutions contributed to the educational landscape. Boston University and Northeastern, Boston College and Tufts, Brandeis and Wellesley, Amherst and Williams. The list went on and on. Each had its own character, its own strengths, its own community of students and scholars. Together, they made Massachusetts one of the most educationally rich places on earth, a state where learning was valued and where the life of the mind was taken seriously. The colleges and universities were also major employers. The faculty and staff, the administrators and support workers, the people who ran the dining halls and maintained the buildings, all of these jobs depended on the institutions. The students who filled the dormitories and apartments spent money in local businesses, supporting restaurants and shops, landlords and service providers. The economic impact of higher education was enormous, even if it was not always fully appreciated. Politics in Massachusetts had its own distinct character. The state was reliably Democratic, had been for decades, and would remain so. The political culture was shaped by the immigrant communities that had transformed the state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by the labor movement and the Catholic Church, by a tradition of activist government that saw a role for the state in addressing social problems. The Kennedy family, with its roots in Boston, had become a national dynasty, and their influence on Massachusetts politics was profound. The institutions of government, the courts and the legislature, the agencies and commissions provided stability and continuity. They were not always efficient, not always responsive, not always free from the influence of money and connections. But they functioned, they endured, they provided a framework within which the business of the state could be conducted. For most people, Politics was something that happened in the background, affecting their lives in ways they might not always notice, but rarely demanding their direct attention. The identity of Massachusetts was bound up with all of these elements: the education and the politics, the history and the institutions. It was a state that took itself seriously, that believed in its own importance, that saw itself as a leader rather than a follower. This self-regard could sometimes shade into arrogance, but it also provided a sense of purpose and direction. Massachusetts knew who it was, and that knowledge gave its people a foundation on which to build their lives. Looking back at Massachusetts in the 1970s, what emerges is not a picture of drama or crisis, but of ordinary life, continuing through a time of gradual change. The decade did not announce itself with bold declarations or sudden transformations. It unfolded quietly, day by day, season by season, as people went about the business of living. For those who were children in the 70s, the decade is remembered through the particular lens of childhood: the freedom to roam the neighborhood, the games played in the street, the long summer days that seemed to stretch on forever, the schools and the teachers, the friends and the enemies, the small triumphs and disappointments that loomed so large at the time. These memories are personal, specific, irreplaceable. They belong to individuals, but they are also shared, part of a collective experience that binds together everyone who grew up in that time and place. For those who were adults, raising families and building careers, the 70s were years of work and responsibility. The jobs that paid the bills, the houses that needed maintenance, the children who needed care and guidance, the worries about money and health, about the future and the past, the satisfactions of accomplishment and the frustrations of limitation. Adult life in the 70s was not so different from adult life in any other decade, but it was shaped by the particular circumstances of the time, by the economy and the culture, by the possibilities that were open and the constraints that were real. For those who were elderly, the 70s were years of watching the world they had known slip away, the neighborhoods changing, the old ways fading, the young people speaking a language that was hard to understand, but also the satisfaction of having lived, of having built something, of having contributed to the ongoing story of family and community. The elderly of the 70s had seen the Depression and the war, had lived through transformations that made the changes of the 70s seem modest by comparison. They had perspective, and they had stories to tell. Massachusetts in the 1970s was a place in transition, but it was also a place of continuity. The same families had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations. The same institutions, the churches and the schools, the businesses and the clubs, continued to structure daily life. The same landscapes, the hills and the harbors, the streets and the squares, provided the backdrop against which everything happened. Change was real, but so was persistence. The past was not erased. It was layered over, built upon, carried forward into the future. The decade ended as it had begun, without fanfare or announcement. The calendar turned, and suddenly it was the 1980s. The changes that had been building through the 70s would accelerate in the new decade. The technology companies of Route 128 would boom and then face new competition. The cities would continue their transformations. The old industries would fade further into memory. But the people who had lived through the 70s would carry that decade with them, part of who they were, part of how they understood the world. Memory is selective, and the Massachusetts of the 1970s that lives in memory is not quite the same as the Massachusetts that actually existed. The difficulties are softened, the pleasures heightened, the ordinary moments forgotten, while the special ones remain vivid. This is how memory works, and it is not a flaw, but a feature. The past that we remember is the past that matters to us, the past that has shaped us, the past that we carry forward as part of our identity. For those who lived in Massachusetts in the 1970s, the decade remains a touchstone, a reference point, a place to which memory returns. It was not a perfect time, not a golden age, not a paradise lost. It was simply a time, like any other, when people lived their lives as best they could, when they loved and worked and struggled and hoped. It was a time that is gone now, that can never be reclaimed, that exists only in memory and in the traces it left behind. But it was real, and for those who remember it, it will always be part of who they are.